Hello, I'm John Butler, Investment Director at Fortune and Freedom. And this week, we learned that President-elect Trump, is indeed going to impose tariffs on countries around the world. In fact, perhaps no country will escape this new risk to international trade and, of course, the financial markets. But what's interesting about it is how Trump has presented his proposed tariff. He's linking this to the U.S. immigration and drug abuse issues because he's claiming that a very dangerous drug, fentanyl, is being brought across the border illegally by people entering the country illegally. And so he's selling his tariff policy also as a border control policy and a war on drugs policy. Sound surprising? Not to my colleague, Nick Hubble, who predicted this fully 1 year ago. And he joins me now. Nick, welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me again.
Look, another astonishing prediction. You have this uncanny knack for identifying what to others are completely obscure, irrelevant developments that you claim are going to eventually become mainstream topics that will impact the financial markets. Here we go again. Very well done. Congratulations. But could you please elaborate on how you managed to predict this very surprising turn of events?
Yeah, it probably goes back to January 2020 or the months before that when I started researching about the Uyghur genocide that was taking place in Xinjiang, China. Some research developments that came out of actually the guy that prosecuted, I think, Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia is a British researcher. His name escapes me just now. And I argued with my colleague Boaz Shoshan, who you know back then, that all of this was going to blow up into an international scandal and that many different countries around the world would agree to a trade war against China on the backing of the fact that China was having these human rights abuses done to the Uyghurs and several other communities in Xinjiang in the west of China. And we predicted that this trade war would escalate and get worse, and Trump would lead this. And that started to gain traction and kick off just when the pandemic hit. And we ended up with a much bigger story. And Trump was able to actually renegotiate a trade deal with China back then by threatening action on the Uyghurs and on Xinjiang. In the end, though, not much came of it. And I believe the same thing is happening right now with fentanyl, with opioids. So there is a major crisis inside the US with opioid addiction, opioid abuse, deaths. It's causing economic and social chaos on a huge scale. We believe, based on our research, that this is spreading to Europe. It's already spread quite well to Canada, quite badly. But a lot of Europe, in the areas in the quarters around the main train station, it's the same as you see in those famous videos in parts of the US where it's just everyone's addicted to opioids and it's just a complete catastrophe, basically. And so I argued about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, actually, in a research piece that the same story was going to play out, that this fentanyl crisis or scandal was going to be the justification for a trade war against China. Why China? Because China is producing those opioids, a lot of them synthetic and a lot of them at a low quality, possibly by leaders of the Chinese Communist Party or members of the Chinese military. They get moved to Mexico and then smuggled across the border as part of this open border policy crisis and the immigration crisis that we're seeing in the US. And so the idea here was that the likes of Trump would decide to bring these two issues together in order to push for trade war policies against China that are really an economic policy. What I think he's doing here is taking the moral high ground. He's saying to his political opponents who disagree with tariffs, maybe those are two separate groups, his political opponents and those who disagree with tariffs, that if you want to object to what I'm doing, you're going to have to be pro-fentanyl and pro-China and pro-genocide, which is not so popular a place to be.
Well, it certainly would seem politically clever then for Trump to find a way, however creative, to link these sorts of issues. But what do you think? Does that then mean that it's more likely than not that Trump is going to succeed in pushing his proposed tariffs through the Congress such that they actually become effective?
I think the key to understanding this is the international aspect. Trump's tariffs and economic policies won't really work as well unless they get international backing, right? And so he's picking an issue that it will get international traction from people who don't want to be framed as pro-fentanyl, pro-drugs policy, or pro-open border policy is popular, very unpopular in Europe now. Whether the tariffs sort of work in their intended effect, I'm not so sure. I think he's conflating the two issues in order to get the moral high ground. Whether that makes it more likely to pass in the US Congress, you would know better than me, John. But I think the fact that he has the moral high ground means that his political, like you say, it's politically clever strategy, right? So politically, he's going to have the advantage now, and he's going to be able to label anyone who opposes his tariff policy as pro-fentanyl and pro-China.
Well, certainly, as you say, by taking the moral high ground, of course, other factors equal, that makes it more likely that his threats of tariffs would get through both houses of Congress. And of course, at the international level, as you say, it is only if other countries take the threat seriously that Trump can use this threat of tariffs as the basis for a general renegotiation of trade agreements with U.S. trading partners around the world, not only China, but in theory, anyone, including, of course, the UK and the EU. And so I would argue, therefore, that the perception around the world now is that Trump is absolutely deadly serious about using this lever to get his way. And not only with respect to trade policy, but as you and I have also linked trade to defense policy. That is, getting Europe to pay its fair share for its own defense. Do you agree?
Yeah, and we've seen this negotiation tactic work in the past, right? On that defense issue, Trump threatened to leave NATO and all this sort of thing. But what he was really trying to do is get Europe to spend more on defense, and that's what they did. So it's a similar story there. And he's returning with the same sort of negotiation tactics and methods here. But what makes this so interesting, at least for the Chinese, is the historical allegory, right? So this is history rhyming to an extraordinary extent, especially for the Chinese leadership. So I've called it in my analysis a third Opium War. And that's a reference to the first two Opium Wars that occurred about 200 years ago, 180 years ago now, where the UK faced a massive trade deficit with China because it was importing so much silk and tea from China. And China refused to trade for British goods. And the only way that the net difference could be settled was silver. So there was this massive outflow of silver from the British Empire to China because of all this tea and silk. And it's difficult to exaggerate just how big that issue was. And the solution that the British came up with was to get the Chinese addicted to opium, opium grown and manufactured and refined and made in India, and British India at the time. And that was only sold to the Chinese for silver. And this rebalanced trade stopped the outflow of silver from the British Empire to China. It also completely ravaged Chinese society, the Chinese economy, the Chinese government, caused rebellions and all sorts of crises. And each time the Chinese decided to try and stop this opium trade, the Royal Navy would come along and it would sail up the river and blow the hell out of the Chinese Navy and blow the hell out of Chinese cities until the Chinese agreed to a settlement. And actually, the acquisition of Hong Kong was part of one of those settlements. And so we've got this weird history rhyming side here where China's smuggling opium or fentanyl, which is an opioid, into the US via Mexico, which is causing all sorts of economic and social damage and political consequences as well inside the US, just general destabilization. It's also having a trade effect. The Chinese are buying lots of gold for their reserves. And so for the Chinese leadership to be picked up on the connection between trade and opioids by Donald Trump, I don't know if he realizes what he's doing, but it's really hitting a nerve. It's difficult to describe how big a nerve that is for the Chinese. And so it's absolutely fascinating that, either Trump's a genius or he's just sticking his foot in it as a coincidence. I don't know which one to believe. But either way, he might be in for a surprise if he doesn't realize what he's doing here. But if he does, he's doing an extraordinarily good job.
Well, as you say, maybe he is just lucky, but this is very much history rhyming, but also echoing because things are moving in the other direction.
Yeah, and that's the irony in all of this, right? Is, the empire has changed in the sense that it's America now. The silver and the opium is flowing the other way. So the Chinese thought they were getting away with a sense of irony themselves this time around. No, they are, and they have been, and so Trump's been pulling them up on this. And the question, as we've discussed earlier now, is whether the international community sort of catches on to what's going on here. If they are starting to see these Chinese opioids coming into their cities, then they might just take up Trump's side in this, I don't want to call it a crusade, but this campaign.
Nick, as part of this historical analogy, you were talking about silver moving from the British Empire to China in exchange for all of the tea and silk and everything else. But in a way, a similar thing's also been happening in recent years. China and a number of other big net exporters have been accumulating gold. And indeed, that gold accumulation has got to the point where some of the largest volumes of gold that trade now are trading outside of the traditional centers, London and New York. But the net flow of precious metal has been very, very much in one direction, from west to east in recent years. That's going to impact, in fact, it is impacting the precious metals markets. And it's got to be part of the explanation for why the price of gold has risen so strongly over the past couple of years. Do you think that's going to continue?
Yeah, so what's occurring here is very similar to, I guess, the Opium War days, in the sense that the US is throwing its weight around in terms of using the US dollar as a weapon, specifically against Russia so far. And so an alternative is needed. And as you've written about in your book, The Golden Revolution Revisited, gold is the obvious go-to asset, right? So China's accumulating gold and arguably selling US dollars and US treasuries in order to be ready for the system change. And so the trade war might actually accelerate that, and might actually accelerate the accumulation of gold from west to east, as you say. And this would supposedly or potentially spike the gold price, because it would create like a run on the gold market in order to have this alternative ready for the post-US dollar reserve currency world type of thing. The question is which way Europe's going to go. And this is something we discussed with Jan Nunhus and our Gold Summit 2025, which we're launching in a week and a few days. So I hope people will check out the Gold Summit and Jan Nunhus's interview. We also talk with you about the way this gold currency system, trading system, reserve system might emerge, why gold is the superior asset. And once people understand all of that, they might see how the trade war and the relaunch of this third opium war will trigger all of these predictions that we're going to be making.
Well, they really do all overlap with one another. That is, all of these issues are related, and major historical changes, regime changes, turning points generally see multiple major issues converging in this way: trade, money, and of course, geopolitical rivalries, and the US's use of sanctions to try to get its way in all of the above. Well, it's certainly a fascinating time to be alive, although a very challenging one to be an investor. I do recommend that all of you register your interest to attend the Gold Summit that we're going to be holding next week and the week after. Thank you very much.